Welcome back, everybody. I want to talk about Socrates today. I am intrigued by the Socratic method. And if you don't know what the Socratic method is, we know that Socrates did not write anything down. He didn't. We know about Socrates not from him, but from those who wrote down what he taught and he did later. But Socrates was obviously one of the great philosophers of the Western world, and he taught verbally. He was in a time of oral tradition, and he taught verbally, and he was known to use a method that we refer to as the Socratic method to this day to help people come up with clarity about key ideas and different topics and themes, topics of justice and beauty and other subjects like that. And he did so by asking thoughtful questions. And he would ask questions that would lead people deeper into the topic and closer to clarity and understanding. And it's a skill that is worth developing. So, I want to talk about the use of questioning when we are trying to solve problems, discover treasures, literal or figurative, and when we are, involved in trying to create new possibilities and opportunities. And so, I have for you 5 types of questions that I'd like to encourage you to practice. And you can. We can all get better at questioning and asking questions. And sometimes even just realizing that asking questions has merit, that it can lead you to greater understanding, greater clarity. You can come to understand other people's perspectives better. You can get closer to solutions. It's great when you're working with teams and small groups of individuals. You're having community conversations about topics and solving problems. And while these are not drawn directly from sort of Socrates' approach, I'm going to give you 5 categories of questions that I've jotted down here that can definitely be helpful in everyday life and work, in those in gameplay, and in those, again, the literal and metaphorical treasure hunting in our lives. So the first one is a clarification question. So a clarification question is when you're talking to other people or when you're reading something, is to begin to dig a little deeper into what they actually mean when they say that. So sometimes when someone says something or when you're reading something, you just sort of assume the meaning, sort of assume the first meaning. But a clarification question challenges you to understand it better and the other person to communicate it more clearly. So a clarification question is sort of a question like, well, what do you mean by that? You use this word. How are you using that word? Or you can sometimes do a clarification question by saying, well, you use this word. Now, when I hear that word, this is what I think. Is that what you mean, or did you mean something different? Now, if you're reading it in a book, you're not going to have the author there immediately to be able to answer. Although in this day and age, sometimes you can reach out to the author and ask them for clarification, and sometimes they'll even reply to you. I actually do that fairly regularly and enjoy having a real dialogue with the authors of books that I'm reading or listening to on Audible. So what do you mean by that? Clarification questions. Try it. Just try it for a while. And even if you think you know what people mean, pause and ask this question. You will find yourself discovering things that you never realized before. And you'll actually find that people are using words in a way differently than you thought. And you can get a little bit more on the same page with people and maybe even come to a better solution. The second one is assumption questions. So assumption questions are asking the question, okay, what are we taking for granted here? What are we assuming? So you're usually not starting at the ground floor with an issue. What are all the things that you're assuming? And get those on the table. And that allows you to discover whether or not those assumptions are helpful or harmful to making progress, solving the riddle, solving the problem, discovering a great solution or not. So what are we taking for granted? And you can frame that question in a lot of different ways, but that's ultimately what you're trying to get at with an assumption question is what are our assumptions? What are we assuming here? What are we taking for granted? Where are we starting? And is that an early enough starting point, or do we have to go back further? The third one then is what supports this claim? This is an evidence question. So if there is a claim that something is true or not true, simply asking, so what's the evidence for this? Or why do we believe this? Evidence can be actually a reason. It can be a sort of rational line of thinking. It can also be data and information. And forcing ourselves to sort of demand more information of ourselves and in others as well, and doing it in a respectful way. I know in our current sort of modern political landscape and so forth, even asking this question can feel like an attack sometimes. People can take it personally, and they assume that you must be on the other side from where they are just because you want more evidence before you adopt what they're saying. but it's important. It's important for us to actually have real evidence, to understand whether we're basing our assumptions and our ideas on thinking on some real facts or not. And to teach ourselves to be neutral and unbiased enough to realize that sometimes maybe what we want to be true, maybe it is true, but we don't have the evidence for it. And so it allows us to at least have some empathy and understanding that the other side or other sides, maybe they're justified in the fact that they don't believe you yet because you haven't given them clear enough evidence and they haven't discovered the clear enough evidence for themselves. So evidence questions, very important, and they can be useful in all sorts of situations. Gameplay, real life, decision making, you name it. Fourth type of question would be consequence questions. So if we follow this idea, what happens? And this is really good when you're trying to come up with solutions. And it's not always easy. So if you want to find some examples of not so great results, go back to one of my videos called The Cobra Effect about the British going into India and them setting up a policy for trying to get rid of the large number of cobras and how their policy backfired on them. You have to watch that video to find out how it plays out. But that was one where they probably could have benefited from asking some consequence questions. When you create a new habit for yourself, a new policy, a new practice, whatever it is, what are the, where does this lead to? If we do this, what's likely to happen next? And you want to be careful not to over speculate. You want to try to, come up with reasonable scenarios. But you can usually get there. You can usually begin to identify and notice that there are some possible negative implications. And the reality is in decision making and in leadership roles, like a leadership role that I'm in, I always have to make decisions that have both positive and negative potential outcomes. It's never 100% the other way. Almost never. 99% of the time. And it's almost 99% of the time that I don't have every single fact that I would like to have in front of me to make the decision. Part of the art of life and leadership is trying to make wise decisions, sometimes in the absence of full information and in a short time frame, and when there are risks to the decision. That's just the nature of decision making. So forcing yourself to ask consequence questions and to think about, okay, well, what's the likely next step to this? But also not getting into like this ideological frame where you sort of use the logical next step. Like if you do this, this terrible thing will happen. This massive slippery slope. Force yourself not to go too quickly down that road and allow yourself to deal with it just on a smaller scale. Do this in bite sizes, and you'll find the consequence question to be really helpful for daily decision making and bigger problem solving and solving clues and all sorts of other things. And by the way, when you're doing actual treasure hunts and even games, this is quite useful because sometimes the designers of the games didn't design the game very well. But if you are going down some kind of rabbit hole and you have a solution, and if you allow yourself to say, okay, if I think this is a solution and I go there, what's the next step? You'll sometimes find that it leads you to a completely unrealistic next step that any reasonable designer of the game or treasure hunt would not have done, or it even breaks their own rules. So that can be very useful. Fifth one then is alternative questions. And I love this one. I find this one very useful. I use it all the time in my workplace and in my life some too. But this is the alternative question is asking about whether there are other ways of doing it other than what you see. Is there another way to look at this? Are there other options other than the ones that we've put on the table? So what are the alternatives is really the question. And try to get as many alternatives as you can on the table. It doesn't mean that you like them. It doesn't mean that you're going to give them a whole lot of credit even, but just get them on the table. In fact, I admit that I frustrate some people sometimes because maybe there is a situation and there are two main options available, and some people want to just, let's pick one of these two, let's figure out the best one, and we move forward, not waste a lot of time with it. And I will want to linger on it a little bit more and say, hey, let's just stop. Okay, I know we talked about these two options, but is there a third option? Is there a fourth? Is there a fifth option? And I want to get all 5 options on the table, and then we can dismiss one at a time until we get to the one we think is going to be the best. So that's what you're trying to do with this alternative question. Is there another way to solve this? Or if you're just trying to understand something, is there another way to see this? Can I look at this from another angle? Literally, physically, walk to another place and look at it from another angle. Or you're trying to solve a clue or a problem. Works really well. These 5 approaches, so you have your clarification questions, your assumption questions, your evidence questions, consequence questions, and your alternative questions. If you just practice and get really good at asking questions in those 5 categories, I think you will find some pretty amazing results. So give it a try and let me know what you discover.